Tara Thiagarajan. Welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Thanks, Mahan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tara, I love your story, your impact, what you're doing at Sapien Labs, which I think can be significant to so many people all around the globe, and most especially right here in the greater Washington, D.C. region where you reside and Sapien Labs is based out of. But before we get to that, would love to know about your upbringing and its impact on you. Starting out in India, what was your upbringing like, Tara?
Well, I'm, as I like to say, half and half. So my mother's American and my father's Indian. And I grew up in India. I was born in India. I did my schooling in India and then came to the United States for college. So, and my life has been largely, I would say, I have to call it somewhat serendipitous and back and forth a lot between these two continents and two countries, between the United States and India.
So, Tara, having an American mom who was in India, and this is a little while back, how did that and having two elements of two cultures impact you?
Um, it's an interesting journey because as a child, the two worlds were quite separate. And, I would come to the United States in the summer and it was a completely different environment. And then, I was living in India, I was in, school in India. And for the most part, these two worlds didn't much intersect with one another until maybe I was around, in college and after, when it became a lot more common, as sort of globalization was growing, people started mixing. And, so many of my friends from India came to the United States. People from here in the United States would travel more to India. And then that's when I think the confusion really started, because there was a period in time where you just grew up a bit like a chameleon, and there was this world and this world. You were one in this side and, and something else on the other side. And you just assumed that they're two very different places. They behave very differently and you just fit into both. And then when they start to mix and mingle, then you have to start to think a lot about, so which one should I be, or which one am I? And I think that's certainly a very, interesting journey, because it's sort of thinking about, do you have to make a choice between different perspectives and paradigms and, sort of cultural outlooks, or are you, because if you've been always, adapted to the particular environment, I think that's a sort of ongoing challenge that you always have to contend with.
Then it's interesting, even to this day, when I have to fill out boxes on forms, whether it's for myself or for my girls, we try to put people in containers and in boxes of what they are. And for people with a multicultural background or a background like yours, it's hard to know, what box do I put myself in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is, as I said, I felt like I've been in both boxes, right? Because, my kids will sometimes, which one is your real accent? And I said, I've had both since the day I was born, and as my name also, my mother says it in one way and my father says it in another way. And so they were both different accents. I was both. And so it's certainly a challenge to find a single box and to meld boxes even.
You have that cognitive and also emotional ability to fit in a lot of different boxes, which I think contributes to some of what Sapien Labs is all about. Now, what is it growing up? You wanted to become Jane of the Jungle. Where did that come from?
Yeah, no. So, when I was young, I had a lot of, so I went through, when I was probably like 15 or 16, a phase of fascination with reptiles. in the, I lived where I lived, there was this crocodile bank, and then we had these tribes in India, these snake catching tribes, and some friends of mine and I had co-opted one of these tribesmen to teach us about how to catch all the snakes in the area, which there are many. So we did all these sorts of things, and later on, I also spent, when I was around 19, I spent 9 months in East Africa working on conservation projects out in, the Masai Mara, and so I always had this. I guess when I was younger, had this fascination with what it must be like to sort of survive out in the wild and all of that. But it has since faded.
Well, I have to first find out about these snakes. Were these venomous snakes that you were catching? And
Oh, not all of them, really. So most snakes are not venomous. There are, of course, South India, where I grew up, has cobras, but most of the snakes there are quite harmless, like the rat snakes that look a lot like cobras. But there are also these snakes. I don't know if you've seen these Indiana Jones movies where people fall into whole pits of snakes.
yes.
So you get these clumps of snakes that you can pull out from between these, I don't know what you call them, but the little paths between paddy fields. They live there in clumps. They're called keelbacks, and they're the most harmless snakes. You can just really pull them out in clumps and they won't do anything. So it's always very fun because people are scared of them, and you can just they're so harmless. So that can be entertaining.
I'll take your word for it, Tara. I'm not sure I want to experience that. I'll take your word for it. What did your parents think of your desire to find and catch snakes and then spend time in the African savannah?
My parents were quite open-minded people. I mean, the fact that they first of all married each other at the time that they did, they're both fairly adventurous themselves. And because we were such a multicultural, multi-everything family, and for my mother also to have made the transition to move from the United States to India, it was a little, I guess, probably more talked about with more extended family and others who thought I was a little bit crazy. But I don't know, my parents never found it all that bizarre.
So now you came to US at Brandeis to study. Why pursue a degree in math?
So this is a question I get asked, and it's an answer. The answer to that is not one I'm terribly proud of. But I was good at math when I was in high school, and at the time it was really like I think the ethos in India was very much people went in, if you were good at math, you went into science and or math or something in that area, and I think a lot of education at that time, and certainly my perspective at that age, was that it was a means to an end. It was not something you did for its own sake in any way. It was not for the education itself. It was so you got a degree for something, or you checked the box in a sense. So when I came to the United States, for my undergrad, math had the least number of course requirements, so I could finish the degree fastest. And I soon learned why that was the case, because the classes themselves were quite a bit more, I'd say, difficult than probably many of the other majors. But that was the reason I did it. And sometimes I do regret that, it's not the right reason to do a math major, and not that I was terrible, but I was certainly not on a path to being a mathematician. And I always thought, perhaps in retrospect, if I had done, physics or something like that, it would have actually served me better with the interest that I was developing as I was there.
So you studied math. Why then go to business school after that?
A lot of, it's like I said, the path has been very serendipitous, and it's certainly not one that was, I think a lot of my trajectory has been, sort of the intersection of, the expectation of what everybody does in in the community that I grew up in India, and my own inclinations, which were quite different from that. And so it was always a bit of a tussle this way and that way. When my family in India is a very business oriented family. It's sort of it's multiple generation business family. And the expectation was always that you join the family business. So, you go and do some sort of science degree, or then you do an MBA, you come back to the business. And that was sort of like the implicit expectation. No one assumed you would try to do anything different from that. And I think as an undergrad, for me, that was the first time that I was seeing a new environment and like people who were doing other things, because the community I grew up in was, I think, largely unidimensional in that way. For instance, I didn't know a single scientist as a child. And I didn't know, pretty much most of the people I knew were in some form of business or another. And so coming to the United States as an undergraduate, you start to see so many different fields, and the fact that, the whole concept of a liberal arts education that you can explore and, try different things. And suddenly you realize like, wow, there's a much bigger world out there. There's so many different things that you can do. And I think there were, two factors. One was that I didn't know, it took me time to understand that, what was available. And by the time I figured out, I was already in my junior year. And so, it was, no one told me previously that you have all these different options that you could study there. It was sort of like, go do this, come back, and, this is what you do. So I think partly it was the time it took me to understand all of the opportunities available. And also, at the end, when I was, my last year, my father was unwell and had a heart attack and was quite, was bedridden. So I went back to India after my undergrad at that point. And it was, and I had not had time to do enough of the courses that I wanted to do. And at that time, I was thinking of potentially, something in physics or in that, sort of that domain of science. But I didn't have a major in that. And so then I had to figure out really like, where do I go from here, And I'd gone back to the family business. I spent some years running actually a textile manufacturing unit as part of my family while my father was unwell, and then he recovered. And I really felt at that point that, I've just been exposed to this whole world in the United States. And now I'm back here and this is not where I belong. This is not what I'm meant to be doing. But I had to figure out what was I then meant to be doing. And so I didn't have that answer at that point. And I couldn't apply to PhD programs because I didn't have the prerequisites. So I went to business school like everybody else. And while I was there, I worked I played around, I took some classes in different areas of science, and then, ended up in working in a neuroscience lab and doing some neuroscience classes, which sort of led me down that path.
Tara, I bet in your class you were the only person, and you're probably one of the only people to go to a top business school. And while you're at the business school, you are taking undergrad classes
Yes,
in something that really interests you.
exactly. And that was part of the plan. I thought, as long as I just get into a university one way or another, then I can do what I want to.
So you discovered your love and passion while at Kellogg, and but MBA is also not a setup for a PhD program. How were you able to do that and get into Stanford?
So how that transpired was as follows. So I knew when I went to business school that I was not on the path to business at that point, right? It was not my intention. And I really,
Career
at that
people at Kellogg's must not have been very happy with you.
Well, I mean, I did get a job. Actually, I worked in the pharma industry after that. So I was, I was part of the employment statistic and everything. It was not terrible, but No, when I was there, I think so. The way it really happened is that I was exploring different classes in physics and neuroscience, looking through the undergraduate catalog, and I thought, why not take this neuroscience class? So I took an intro to neuroscience, and this was on top of, like, even though you could take additional credits without paying any extra tuition beyond what was required for the MBA degree. So I did this intro to neuroscience class. And one of the things that really sort of pushed me down this trajectory, so the professor, since I was a business school student, to enroll in the class, I had to get his signature. And I went looking for him in his office, and his office was inside the lab. And I'd never been in this kind of lab before. So I walked into the lab and I was looking at stuff there. And so when I went to get the signature, I said, if you don't mind my asking, what is it you're doing over here? So he showed me around the lab, and they were working with slices of brain tissue that have been taken out of a rat. And this brain tissue would be in stay alive in a dish for even up to 16 hours, and they would record activity from the neurons, electrical activity from the neurons in those brain slices. So I'd never had thought such a thing was possible until I had walked in there. And really, it raised so many different questions on what is the nature of life if part of the brain can exist and function outside of the organism. What does this mean? And so that got me really quite interested. And I got to know the professor quite well. He was very new, so he was much older than me. He had just started at Northwestern. And so I asked him once, can I try? Like, how does this work? And he said, okay, let me think about it for a minute. He's like, okay, fine. So he said, yeah, if you want to come and try, like, learn something in my lab, go ahead. So I would come at night. I had to share equipment with the PhD students, who got priority. I'd come at night and they'd teach me stuff, and then I would be able to do stuff, so I had my own research project and all of that. And I think that's really how I ended up going to graduate school, because at the end he said, if you want to apply for a PhD, I'll write your recommendation. And at that point, I hadn't actually thought of that, because I still didn't have a few pieces that they said are required. And I said, I don't have these few requirements. And he said, I wouldn't even worry about that, just apply. So that's how I ended up going out and doing a PhD.
It is fascinating studying brain science and the questions that it raises about, as you mentioned, life, thinking, all those aspects of it. I did some graduate work before on my end, going to business school in human nutrition, and my professor was a neuroscientist himself, looking at the psychophysiological basis of eating behavior, and a lot of it through manipulation of some aspects of the brain physiology, and then introduction of the different hormones. So it raises a lot of questions when you understand the brain well, what it is to actually be a human being, choice, when life begins, when life ends, all of those aspects. So in the PhD program, studying neuroscience, what did you specialize there, Tara?
So I started out, and I've come a very long and far distance from where I started that work. So I started out in sort of cell physiology. And what that really looked like was to look at, the functioning of individual cells. And, we would extract cells from mouse and rat brains and grow them in a dish, and really look at how they respond to different kinds of, sort of external perturbations, how they communicate with each other, and understanding the physiology there. So one part of my work at that point was really looking at different kinds of, I would say, and this is all in a dish, how the changing external environment impacted how the cells behaved and responded. So, and I think, what I learned from that, I think that, there's a very, I think you learn a lot just of how, the building blocks of life and how they behave, that you could take these things out and you can grow them in different ways, and they're going to start behaving in different ways, but nonetheless that, these cells from the brain are just primed to connect with each other. And, no matter where you put them, they will do certain things, like grow out these connections to and form connections with one another and start communicating with one another. So I think some of that just, what are all the different building blocks? How do you manipulate them? And I think those are some of the very interesting things. But at the end of that, my PhD, what I realized, and I think this was really the fundamental insight for me, was that they will behave differently they will respond with something different to every change in the environment, which means that these cells, what they do in the native organism, that's a very different environment as well that you cannot possibly replicate in a lab, in a dish. And so they're probably behaving quite differently. And so from there, I really moved into trying to understand the behavior of the system in the intact form, saying that, this system in the intact form is going to do very different things than when you kind of break it apart and grow it in separate pieces. And, so that was, and that was really sort of understanding complex system behavior in general, at different levels, whether it's atoms interacting to cells interacting to ultimately, as you can start to think about it, as human beings interacting, and what kind of behavior it produces. So
That is a really powerful insight, Tara, in that whether it is with respect to the human systems, organizational systems, communities, systems, as you say, are much greater than some of the parts. And it's a lot harder studying systems. It's a lot easier taking individual parts of those systems, trying to understand, and then drawing conclusions, oftentimes incorrect conclusions, on how those individual systems would impact or individual elements would impact the larger system.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
after that, though, I guess due to circumstances, you ended up going back to India to run Maduro Microfinance. What happened, and what was that experience like, Tara?
So that was, again, I like it's sort of, I can a twist in the path that I would never have predicted. I lost my father. He had a stroke, and he was he was paralyzed for a couple of years before he died. But right before he had the stroke, he had been he was technically retired. He was working with a small nonprofit called the Microcredit Foundation of India that he had set up, and he had been unwell for a year or two before that. So he had been working with this nonprofit on a scale that he could do given his health situation, and he had signed an agreement actually with a major bank right before his stroke. And so I went back when he was one to care for my father, but also to try to sort out some of his financial and other issues. And it was at that time that we discovered that he had signed this agreement to actually take on quite a large portfolio from this microfinance portfolio from this bank. And given that he was unwell, the whole thing had unraveled because there was no one. He had not built a team, and he had just sort of collapsed. So I stepped in to try and solve that issue, and then started for various reasons. Started at this for-profit organization, Madura Microfinance, and as a way for us to, sort of run this operation sustainably and to be able to sort of make good on some of the commitments that nonprofit had made. So that's how I started with this. And at the time, there was certain, I would say, issues that had to be solved, which took us a couple of years to solve. And at that time, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of, this is something I was going to do. I was actually a postdoc at the NIH at the time. So for the first few years, I was a postdoc in the NIH, but trying to solve all these and sort of caring for my father at the same time. And then after he passed away, I realized that we wouldn't easily be able to sort of either shut down that company, or because it's a financial services company, you have micro loans outstanding, they have to be collected, you need to have staff. In order to pay them, you have to continue to generate more revenue, which means you have to continue to grow. So it's a very difficult business to just close up like you could a store or a restaurant. And so what I realized is that, there was really no choice. We had to actually grow the company or build it. There was really no other option for that entity that didn't result in some sort of major financial catastrophe. So I raised venture capital, and after I finished my postdoc, I went back to India. I spent a few years there to build a company and build a team. And we at that it went through, I would say it was a very interesting time at one level, because this was an industry that was new. It was just forming. So at the time when I was getting involved, Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank had just won the Nobel Prize for this. It was seen as this sort of solution to poverty. So there was a lot of media hype about what this was going to do for to eliminate poverty and so on. But I think then there was this period of the reality setting in, where you realize ultimately it's credit that has a benefit, but it's also like any other credit, it's not the solution to the world's problems. It is after all, it is a loan. And it's sort of like attributing, you don't solve poverty by just giving people credit cards, which is essentially what it is with different mechanisms. And so, but there are a lot of different things that there are benefits that it does have. It brings this, credit to parts of the country, parts of the world that don't have access to formal financial systems. So, I learned a lot. It was a new industry. It was a new, it was a new country in a sense for me, because I hadn't worked, for the previous years. I had been in a completely different environment. I had been, doing a PhD and a postdoc. You're working with scientists, and now here, I'm working in India. Culturally very different, but also one of the reasons it's culturally very different is because we were serving sort of the sort of grassroots heartland of the country, and so it's very, very far away. We're serving some of the poorest people, the least educated people. And so for me, that was really a view into, the two extremes of the world, right? On one hand, I have you have all these people that I was working with who were, PhDs from Stanford, from Harvard, from MIT. And then you're here on the other end where, people are, most of them are not literate. You're working in locations that have very little infrastructure and resources, and the poorest in the world. So I think it was certainly a learning experience on many different dimensions. One was for me, I had to really at one point say, okay, I have to take the bull by the horns and build this company. And I hadn't done that before, and it was a industry that I didn't know when I first came into it, and I had to learn the whole finance industry. Learn how to build teams, learn how to sort of scale across the country, work in multiple cultures and languages. And I think also really understand sort of the different ends of the world, essentially. And, really struggle to think, how does it all fit together as one system or one whole humanity when these are so fundamentally different from one another?
Those are important questions that I know you get to at Sapien Labs. But one thing I'm curious about, Tara, is that I'm familiar with venture capital, and usually venture capital doesn't seek out opportunities to make a difference for the sake of the difference. The
Right.
objective is an exit and return to the investors. How were you able to secure venture capital funding for something like this support that you were providing at Madura Microfinance and the microfinancing that you were doing?
So, it's not, I think a lot of it is really the environment of the moment, when I came into microfinance, and I have to say, it was relatively easy to raise money. And the reason is not anything to do with me or what, our organization specifically, but it was a time where, we had on one hand, Yunus had won the Nobel Prize. So it gave this a sheen of like doing good. And then we had others, especially in India. There was a person, Vikramakula, who had started a microfinance company in India, which he was sort of selling as the Starbucks of microfinance, and that he could solve poverty, that greed and poverty could go together. And that, with very high interest rate loans to poor people, you could make a lot of money, and it was going to benefit them also. And I think, of course, there, a lot of the holes in that narrative came crumbling down, and India actually went through a very a huge crisis where the regulators came in and said that the industry is really doing more harm than good, and they started regulating interest rates and so on. So it certainly caused a lot of challenge. But prior to that, first of all, in that early days, when you're pitching it as you could do good and make lots of money, then of course all venture capitalists come flocking. And so it was, there were a number of new organizations that, new venture capital firms, there are a lot of, and it was also a period in time when social entrepreneurship was the buzzword of the day. And a lot of different, early stage venture capital firms came in to invest in the space. So they were also competing with each other. So, there was a desire, because it was a fast scaling, it had the potential to scale. The market size was very large. It was quite easy to raise money at that point. And then following that, the industry went into this tailspin, with this regulatory, with regulation and so on. And at that time, a number of companies went under, and some that survived, who were, sort of working, I would say, more responsibly through this whole process, survived. And then it took a few years. I would say, it was like 3 or 4 years were very tough in the industry, because, the government was going to regulate. They wouldn't say, they dragged their feet on what that regulation would be. So in the meantime, a lot of the capital dried up. But subsequently, it emerged a much stronger, much more strongly regulated, and even self-regulated industry that I think today is a very responsible and very solid industry in India. So it certainly went through all its trials and tribulations to get to where it is today. And I think as it, arrived there, because it was, sort of then on very solid footing, was able to attract not just the early social entrepreneurship venture capitalists, but a lot of private equity money coming into that space as well. So yeah, it certainly was a very interesting journey.
And that Madura still continues, which is outstanding. And you went through a couple of other phases, but in 2016, you found Sapien Labs, which what anyone can see from your journey is that you are really on a quest, Tara. So, what is Sapien Labs all about? And what is the purpose behind this nonprofit organization that you founded?
Yeah, so Sapien Labs again came about somewhat serendipitously, and I would say if there is a common thread for me, it has been, like you say, it's a quest to really make sense of the world and understand, what it means and how it works. And that can be from so many multiple different perspectives. I mean, and I think, I strongly believe that you get greater understanding from actually doing, and not just purely from, as an observer to what is being done. Because I think there's a great deal that you learn when you're actually, building an organization, or when you're actually inside a system trying to reconfigure it in some way, and so on. But I always and part of that quest has always, I think it always has come back in some way to understanding the nature of mind, because ultimately all that we do is filtered through the human mind. And so we really need to figure out, what the nature of mind is that really drives all of these things that we do as human beings and in human systems. So the part of that curiosity, I think, even as I was building a business, and we were answerable to PE firms and so on. Still there's always an element of curiosity that I have to satisfy. And one of the things that we did do at Madura, which I think was extremely interesting, was we were, these are the kind of ecosystems we worked in were all very data dark. And so, these are people who don't have a digital footprint. They don't, they don't have a resume because they've not maybe been to school. And so one of the big questions that comes up, and this is even very specific to that kind of business, is how do you evaluate a person when there's nothing on paper? Right. And you don't have time. You don't have time to get to know them and their families and their, all of that stuff. What are ways in which you can assess, should we give this amount of credit in this village? Will this village be, or to this particular person in this village? So we started looking a lot at, what kind of factors will predict economic outcomes in these kind of small towns and villages, and then what factors predict individual outcomes. And so that was we did a lot of data collection and analysis, and we had some data scientists working on that. During that process, as we were trying to evaluate individuals who had nothing on paper, we did some, cognitive batteries, and we found some very sort of unexpected results where it really was curious, is sort of saying that people think very differently in these kinds of ecosystems than we expect or than we would think. And how do we understand that? And, at the time, I had a data scientist that was working with us. She had been my graduate student. I had been, I had a small lab in India simultaneously. I was trying to keep one toe in neuroscience in some way. And she was a computational neuroscientist. She joined us as a data scientist. And she said, I wonder what their brain activity is like. And so we were, talking about it, and really were curious as is there a difference in brain activity? Because in neuroscience has all, there's been sort of this implicit perspective from which people have worked, that there is the human brain, and you'll see this a lot in the literature, the human brain, the human connectome, and this idea that, there's something prototypical about the brain that's common to all individuals. And which is not unreasonable in the sense that every other organ behaves the same way, right? The heart beats the same for every human, and so on. So, we thought, why not, so we're really curious, and I wanted to also measure the brain activity, and we weren't in a position as a financial services company to do such a thing, clearly. But I said, so Danya, who is my graduate student and who's working with me, she found this device that was easily portable. We could take it out in the villages, and it wasn't too expensive. So I said, all right, I will buy one personally. And you and I are going to go, and we're going to find out the answer to this question. So this is just because we have to satisfy this curiosity one way or another. So we just went out one weekend, and we recorded brain activity from a whole bunch of people in this remote village, which was you had to, it wasn't on the main road or anything. You had to walk off and a few kilometers from the road. They didn't have electricity much and all of that. And then when, we looked at a lot of different aspects of that physiology, and we compared it to, people we knew, like friends and family and people, colleagues, and so on in the city. And we found fundamental differences between these two groups. And they were small groups, 10, 12 people on both sides. But the differences were huge, just profound. And, you typically in science, when you're working with cells and all of that, a lot of people look for like, 15% difference. Is it a statistically significant difference? And here we're seeing, distributions that are barely overlapping. And so, my first reaction was, okay, if this is true, it's absolutely profound, because it's saying that human beings, the brain physiology of individuals can be fundamentally different. And the question is why, and what's causing it. But of course, the other side of it could be very much that, we thought people use hair oil in India, coconut oil in their hair in South India. So we thought, then mostly in the villages. So we thought maybe, it's the coconut oil disrupting the sensors. And so what we're recording over there is completely different because of the coconut oil. And so, it could be either. But we said, okay, but we need to know which one it is. Is it this or is it that? And so if we need to do it in a controlled way, and I say, let's do something proper. Let's do this as a proper experiment. And so we needed a home. And so that's how Sapien Labs was founded, as a place and a home in which we could, as a nonprofit, where we could do this kind of research. And so we did the first research study there, where we looked across very remote villages in India all the way up to the cities, so of different, and looked at what we call the stimulus environment, your access to technology, and really to look at, how has modernization, is this journey from this pre-modern kind of ways of living without any of these technologies and so on, does that have anything to do with the big differences that we're seeing? And the answer was yes. And so when what we were able to see is that brain physiology itself changes fundamentally as your stimulus environment changes. And there are certain things, for example, that, when you transition to smartphones, certain features appear in your brain very strongly that don't exist or are not detectable with this kind of recordings prior to, people who don't have smartphones. So clearly there's a big impact of how our, the world is changing us. And the question is, what does that mean? In some ways, maybe some of these are beneficial cognitively. In other ways, perhaps we are seeing, we are finding challenges. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, is that, at some point on the curve, there are cognitive benefits. And then and beyond a certain point, we're starting to see a lot of emotional challenges. And that's really so that's been the journey. And then, from there, we've really started looking more broadly at how is the environment changing human beings? Because it's an important question that I think that we need to be on top of, because we haven't recognized how profoundly we're being changed, and also in some, the magnitude of some of the negative ways in which we're being changed.
What incredible insights and findings, Tara. And I look forward at some point having a conversation and recording a podcast just on the brain science and the impact of it on so many different factors, including societal, community factors. But there are a couple of parts of it that I would love to touch on now, in that in many instances, we assume behaviors are a function of cultural differences. If I understand you right, is that some of what you were isolating with respect to the differences were physiological differences in the brain, which had come about as a result of the stimuli in the environment.
Yes, exactly.
So, with that being the case, then uh, therefore would the kind of approaches, policies that communities, organizations, people have an impact on the future potential of the individuals, not necessarily just the youngest children, but people at different stages of their lives.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that really has been a recurring theme in the results that we're finding is how much that culture and environment is really playing a role. And I think it has profound influences, and I think we're seeing it in multiple ways. One thing I can, as a very stark example, what I can tell you is, if you look at individual outcomes in villages, in small villages in India, an individual's potential from an economic success point of view is constrained entirely by the system. So basically, whether someone is successful or not can be predicted with very, very high accuracy and precision based on the infrastructure of the ecosystem he lives in. How far his village is to the road, how frequent the bus is, whether they have continuous electricity, if he has a cell phone connectivity. All of those things will set the parameters for how successful someone can be. And I give the example to people, say it's all about the individual, say it's all about the individual, and say if you take someone, whether they have a Harvard MBA or anything, and you put them in that ecosystem and you say you have no phone, no electricity, no transport, are you going to be as successful as if you were, if we dropped you in Boston or in Silicon Valley? No, you can't. The environment is fundamentally going to constrain what input you get and what output you're able to put out there. And that's the extreme version of it. But that takes place in everyone's microenvironment wherever they are. So I think that what we're seeing today now in this other project that we're doing that's very global, called the mental state of the world, where we look at we track mental well-being across multiple countries, and we look at sort of different factors that are driving changes or differences between, changes across time and differences between countries. One of the things that we see is that, cultural factors have a huge, very significantly and highly correlated with mental well-being of countries. So countries which are more individualistic, more performance-oriented, and on the other hand have a weaker, what they call in-family collectivism. And these are indicators developed by other groups that are creating cultural indicators for countries and so on, that these countries actually have poorer mental well-being than countries that are lower on individualism and higher on that in-family collectivism. So that's another example of, that's a mental outcome, and it's, mental well-being relates to many aspects of the human being, from their mood and outlook to your what we call social self, like how you view yourself and how you form relationships with others. So, a number of factors like this sort of play into mental well-being as a whole, but it really tells you that it's the cultural environment has a big impact on how you feel and how you see yourself, and therefore how you're also going to behave. Because how you see yourself and feel is, dictates a lot of your behavior. So I think really the challenge is understanding what kind of environments, what kind, from social environment to stimulus environment really drives the best kind of human outcomes, and how do we then take that and translate it into policies and interventions that can, that can shift these outcomes towards the better.
It's incredible on so many different levels, Tara, including the fact that some of your findings challenge some of the traditional things people have said with respect to you take a successful person and drop them anywhere without any support, they're going to become the same successful person they were before. What some of your findings show is the impact of those environmental factors, including even on the
The brain
brain
itself.
physiology. So it's not that there isn't agency, but I think a lot of times we attribute way too much when we see people who have succeeded to their agency, rather than understanding all of the impact all these different factors bring to bear, including on the physiology of the brain. One of the things that I've been very fascinated with, Tara, is the fact that until about 100 years ago, Danes were some of the shortest people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And due to different factors, most especially due to nutrition, They are some of the tallest people in the world. So, the same way that visually we can see that, what I'm hearing from some of your studies and research is that not only with respect to nutrition, but with respect to stimulus and cultural elements, there's a lot of impact on the brain, including the physiology, and that exhibits itself through the different factors of success that the individual can exhibit.
Yes, and I think it's also, I mean, it's I would say, you know, the way I sort of think about it now is that you can't actually say you know, anything about an individual in absolute without the perspective of a context. It's always, you know, what is the outcome of the individual given the context that they're in, and without the given the context that they're in, you only have one half of the equation. You can't, you know, you don't know what, without that other side, you can't really make a good prediction. But I would say, you know, at least in the smaller ecosystems, and of course that the individual factor, I think, may be greater as the size of the ecosystem starts to grow, because there are just more degrees of freedom essentially that a person has to explore and understand, you know, a larger ecosystem. But in smaller ecosystems, in the smaller villages, more than 80% of a person's outcome were really factors of context. And I think, you know, it sort of decreases, but it's still very substantial, even in large ecosystems where you have, you know, quite different microenvironments.
Now, in addition to that, as you mentioned, you have been doing this mental state of the world report. I would highly encourage for the listeners to go to the sapienlabs.org website, read the full report that you have accessible. Would love to touch on a couple of elements that came out in your latest report, Tara. One of them is the fact that education and employment were associated with higher mental health scores.
Mhm.
So, can you talk briefly about that and the impact it has on communities and society at large?
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things is education and employment are also related to so many different things, right? So first of all, you know, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to have higher income. So, you know, there are other factors at play that are sort of embedded in those relationships that we haven't untangled in this particular report. But I think, you know, certainly the more education, the more income, maybe the more different types of opportunities that you have, and those are probably they may also, you know, having higher education may also be reflective of your you know, sort of early childhood experience. So for example, if someone had a very rough childhood where there was not money to go to college, and or, you know, had to take care of an ailing parent, so didn't go to college, I mean, all of those factors, you know, are sort of embedded in, you know, who's has education and who doesn't, right? It's so I think you can't say it's education per se, but the fact that you could get to a certain level of education reflects many things. It reflects your whole like life, you know, to some degree, your life trajectory, the environment you're in, the possibilities that have been available to you, and so on and so forth. But that said, I think, you know, if more people have those opportunities, that could be ultimately beneficial. I think one of the very interesting, you know, and I think it's also, I would add to that, like the less education you have, perhaps the more difficult it is to make sense of the world, and the fewer opportunities and, you know, sort of degrees of freedom available to you in terms of what you can do. And so all of those, I think, would, you know, tie into or dictate your mental well-being profile. I think in terms of employment, there's something a little bit more interesting. First of all, it's clear that, you know, being employed has mental health benefits. You know, someone being unemployed, losing a job, losing income, livelihood, ways to make ends meet, so on. Also, you know, the sort of stigma of losing a job, all of those things are you know, play into that. So certainly being employed has tremendous benefits relative to being unemployed. But what's very interesting is that this, the difference between unemployed and employed is much higher in countries, these English-speaking countries, what we call the core Anglosphere, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and so on, compared to other countries, even Europe or Latin America. And part of the, the way I interpret that is that in the United States, so much of a person's sense of self is tied up in, much more of a person's sense of self is tied up in that employment and in that job, relative to other countries which are more collectivist, where your belonging to society, your sense of who you are has other dimensions, and therefore, like, being unemployed doesn't cause you perhaps to plummet as much as in countries where that occupies a much larger part of your sense of self.
In addition to that, one other area I would love to touch on, Tara, is, and you also mentioned it, the alarming decline in mental well-being of younger generations, and that as a global phenomenon, not just something that people are experiencing in the US. So I would love to get your thoughts on what you believe has contributed to that, and what can communities, families, societies do about that? It is alarming, to your point.
Yeah. So I think, just so that, people understand exactly what we're seeing. So we see, for example, in older generations in all regions of the world that we've looked at, from Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, Europe, United States, and so on, North America, everywhere. That older people, maybe about 7-8% of people have challenges with their mental well-being, and what we call a level of that they're distressed or struggling at a level that would impact their functioning and could be considered clinical in some way. Whereas when you get to young people, 18 to 24, it's 44%, and each successive generation, it's lower. Now, one of the things that you might think is that, okay, if maybe young people are just more, depressed, and as you get older, you see the world and, through in a more positive way. But that doesn't appear to be what's going on, simply because when we look at studies of well-being, happiness and well-being 10 years ago, from the early 2000s, that young people were always, in all cultures, countries, had the highest well-being, the highest happiness. And so, while there were different patterns in different parts of the world, what was consistent was young people always had the were best off. And today they are in really, really poor state of mental well-being. So it really looks like it's a generational decline that has taken place starting probably sometime after 2010. And the one thing that's common, and I should point out that the Mental State of the World report focuses on internet-enabled populations, so not the offline, low-income communities, that we've looked at in other contexts. But among this group, the one thing that is common across all these countries is the advent of the internet and the smartphone, the mobile phone particularly. And what we see is that when you come to, the 18 to 24-year-olds are probably the first generation that grew up almost entirely on the internet. And, the last, from middle school onwards, were probably had, their own cell phone, smartphone, and continuous internet access. So, the question is, what has that done? Is that, in what way or how could that have been, have played a role? There's been quite a bit of research out there where people have tried to say, okay, if you reduce screen time, or you take time off from your mobile phone, does it improve your mental well-being? Does it not improve your mental well-being? And it's a really, it's the results have been mixed. It hasn't had resoundingly, positive conclusions. Now, one of the things, so what we really, and this is, I would say, this is hypothesis based on the evidence that we see, and also based on the pattern of mental well-being challenges that young people are facing, is that with the internet, we see today, the statistics show that people spend 7 to 10 hours online a day. And what that means is that's taking away from all the other things that we used to do. And, say my generation, if I, think back and, if you talk to folks in this who grew up without the internet, we spent at least a few hours every day engaged in some kind of social interaction, in-person social interaction, where we are, without the digital medium in the middle in any way. Or even like, today you see a lot of young people sort of sitting together, but all on their phone, and maybe even texting each other right there, but not like engaging face to face. But so my generation, I would estimate that people from the low end to the high end would have spent 10,000 to 25,000 hours in engaged in social interaction with their peer groups by the time they come to college. Whereas those who grew up on the internet with, with a smartphone probably spend between 1,500 and 5,000 hours by the time they come to college. And what this means really is that, we have withered the skill of understanding and integrating ourselves into the social fabric. And what we do in in-person interaction is, you learn to read facial expression, you learn to read body language, you learn, the sort of communication of physical touch that happens through that. You also learn so many different things, like how to resolve conflicts. You get in trouble with your friends, you figure out how to get out of trouble with your friends, all of these different things. And you also start to form friendships, that can become these very long relationships in your life. And those are all have all withered in young people. And so there's a profound sort of what we see, the dimension of social self, this sort of ability to form and maintain relationships and your own sense of self has really diminished. And it seems to me that it's because maybe, I'm sure there are aspects of social media and so on that have a negative impact, but more so the fact that we have allowed to wither this development of our social self, our ability to integrate with others. I think that's behind this big challenge that we're seeing.
It's incredible, Tara, from my perspective of trying to understand certain impacts of it. I reflect back on the fact that in the early 20th century to mid 20th century, cigarette smoking was something that was not seen as being unhealthy for many reasons. Even doctors would find themselves recommending cigarette smoking until we started studying it more and seeing the impact of it on health. And it seems like the technology, as you said, is having a negative impact, most especially on the younger generation. How and why, maybe we don't know the specifics of it yet, the same way early on they didn't know the specifics of how the smoke or the smoking caused lung cancer, but there is the correlation with
Mm-hmm.
respect to that well-being. So it is this is an outstanding report. Again, I encourage everyone to read it, try to understand it, whether with respect to the community, with respect to organizations, our loved ones, lots of different insights in there. So, Tara, you are, as we mentioned, a woman on a quest. You're still young, and I know Sapien Labs has many years and many great things ahead of it. So, if we are to reconnect a dozen years from now, and we'll have many more conversations before then. But if we are to connect at that point, and Sapien Labs, from your perspective, has been able to make a substantial difference, what would that difference be?
I think that, so I see, two different dimensions that I think that we can make a big difference. One is, I think, by tracking and showing the world where where these challenges are and what's driving them, and being able to work with stakeholders to really, develop recommendations for policies, for interventions, and enable that. I think, if we can bring that awareness that and really then move the needle on this decline that we're seeing so that we start to reverse it. And we start to see the direction go up instead of down. I think that is a big hope. I think similarly there, or I guess not as a second thing, but more to add to that, I think it's really about trying to get, to understand some of the challenges and the different factors that are leading to these declines, and being able to, provide more concrete evidence that really provides greater impetus for action. And these could be, one aspect, and I think, that I think will play a very significant role is really the social systems that we build, whether it's in schools, how we as people, as parents, think about what our kids are doing. I think in our generation, we reached a point where we thought anytime kids are not like studying or doing something productive, it's a waste of time. But we don't realize that building our social self is fundamental to what humans do, which is we are able to resolve conflict and cooperate. And that's how we've built great things. So we can't neglect that. I think, but the other factors are there, there certainly could be environmental factors, I think, potentially at play that we don't understand. So we're really looking at also on the ground kind of research that's, to understand our, the sort of are there new environmental toxins? For example, there's a lot of different things from pharmaceuticals, from cosmetics that are endocrine disruptors that can cause, other kinds of, can have an impact because when they enter our water and food sources. So there are a number of different, potential risk factors and drivers to explore. And I hope that we'll be able to provide a global perspective on that can, that becomes widely known and can move the needle.
I love the work you're doing, Tara, and from two separate perspectives. One is that there are a negative stimuli in our environment. Technology and use of it in some instances can be one of those. Some of the well-intentioned channeling of efforts, for example, in education, focusing kids only on science, technology, and math, as good as it is, it can have negative consequences. So being aware of the impact of those stimuli, and also the fact that the better we understand the contributors to the brain development and the decision making, the more we can make sure we have a more equitable society and opportunities for more people in our communities. So I wholeheartedly believe your research can help us get there. For the audience to find out more, Tara, about you, about Sapien Labs, where should they go and what resources would you recommend?
Well, I mean, I would say go to our website, sapienlabs.org, and you can explore our programs. We also, have our publications out there and, different things that have been written about it. We have blogs on our website. So I think there's a lot of content there that talks about a lot of the different things we're doing. And yeah, we'd love for people to visit and get to know us.
I would highly recommend it to start out first and foremost with your Mental State of World report. I think it's an outstanding read for all leaders, again, for themselves, for their organizations, for the impact on the community. And I look forward to understanding more from you what we can do as leaders to be a positive force in the lives of people around us. Thank you so much for sharing your own story and the journey and the purpose of Sapien Labs. Thank you so much, Tara.
Thank you, Mahan. My pleasure.